What if the home you spent your entire life building, your dream, your sanctuary, was suddenly ripped away from you? Imagine being punished for something as trivial as your rose bushes being 2 inches too high. But it doesn't stop there. What if the very people you trusted to protect your neighborhood were secretly scheming to steal everything you worked for? The HOA that should be your ally is now your enemy, and they'll stop at nothing to force you out. But what if you could turn the tables? What if you could use their own tactics against them, exposing the corruption that lurks in the shadows? What if this fight was not just about your house, but about saving an entire community from destruction? Get ready. This is the story of one man's fight against a corrupt system, and how he used the power of truth to bring it crashing down. Imagine spending your whole life working toward a dream home that represents years of hard work, sacrifice, and personal effort. For many, that dream is more than just a house. It's a symbol of everything they've built. The late nights, the overtime hours, the sweat, and the long years of raising a family. Our protagonist, let's call him Jack Winters, had done just that. He had carefully planned and built his mansion, a place where he could finally retire in peace, surrounded by a perfect garden that he'd tended to with his own hands. Each corner of that house held memories, from his children's laughter to the quiet evenings with his spouse. The lawn, the rose bushes, the meticulously placed water feature. Everything had its place in his perfect world. Yet, in an instant, that world was about to be shattered. You see, when Jack settled into his retirement, he thought the struggle was over. The house was his sanctuary, the perfect reward for a lifetime of hard work. But there was an unexpected and unwelcome force on the horizon, an HOA, or Homeowners Association. Jack had always followed the rules, keeping his property pristine, but suddenly, he found himself under attack from a group of strangers that seemed to hold power over him. The HOA came knocking with petty complaints about his perfectly maintained garden. At first, Jack thought it was a mistake. Surely, they couldn't be serious about such trivial violations, could they? But soon, the fines and accusations piled up. They targeted him without mercy, enforcing rules that felt designed to destroy, not uphold, the beauty of the community. He couldn't help but wonder, was this what his life had come to? A perfect house, now threatened by people who seemed to have no regard for the effort he'd put into creating his dream? At first, Jack tried to reason with the HOA. After all, he wasn't the kind of person to make waves. He had spent his life being a model citizen, always following the rules, never causing trouble. He thought that if he just explained things calmly, they'd see the absurdity of the situation. But the reality was far darker than he could have imagined. The HOA wasn't just an organization, it was a silent, controlling force within the neighborhood, wielding power over those who lived there. What started with a simple violation about his garden soon spiraled into a series of ridiculous accusations. The water feature in his yard was too large, his mailbox wasn't the right color, and somehow, the bushes were too high. It felt like they were inventing new rules every day. The weight of the fine started to crush him, but the real kicker came when he found out the truth. Jack wasn't alone in this. His neighbors had been quietly suffering under the same oppressive regime. One of his neighbors, Douglas, pulled him aside one day, a nervous look on his face. "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into," he whispered. "Karen Thompson is running for HOA president. She's the one behind all this. Every election cycle, she picks a few people to terrorize to show how tough she is on rule breakers. She's ruthless." Jack was stunned. He'd always thought of the HOA as just a bunch of well-meaning individuals trying to keep the neighborhood nice. But now he realized that the very people who were supposed to be upholding fairness and justice were, in fact, the ones causing harm. He felt like a fool. Here he was, a successful retiree, suddenly feeling powerless against this entity that was slowly strangling his peace of mind. It wasn't just a few rules being broken. It was a full-scale, personal attack. And Jack was the target. Jack didn't want to believe it. He couldn't accept the idea that his dream home, the place where he'd poured so much of his life, was now under siege. But as he stood on his front porch one morning, holding the first of many violation notices, he felt a cold rush of dread wash over him. The letter in his hand was from the HOA, citing all the violations on his property. He read them aloud to himself, feeling his blood boil. Your water feature is non-conforming. Excessive holiday decorations. Your rose bushes are 2 inches too tall. The words seemed absurd to him. He looked at his garden, a place he had spent years perfecting with his wife, and couldn't understand how anyone could find fault with it. But it didn't matter. The fines began to accumulate. The more Jack tried to reason with the HOA, the more they seemed determined to break him. The problem was, he didn't even know who he was fighting. Every time he tried to confront Karen Thompson, the woman behind the attacks, she wore a false smile and gave him empty assurances that rules were rules. She wasn't interested in compromise. Her mission was clear, to push him out. But why? Why had Jack, a quiet retiree who just wanted to enjoy his last years in peace, been chosen as her target? And who was Karen really working for? The answers were out there, and Jack knew he had to uncover them before it was too late. Jack's suspicion grew stronger with every fine, every violation. He knew something wasn't right. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place. He noticed something strange about the properties that were being targeted by the HOA. The families who lived in these homes were being driven to sell at a loss, and just as quickly, the homes were being bought up by a development company. Jack recognized the name immediately, Thompson Development Group. That name rang a bell. It was Karen Thompson's brother's company. The connections were too obvious to ignore. The HOA, which was supposed to be an impartial body, was clearly involved in something much darker. They were pushing homeowners to sell their properties below market value, and then Karen's brother swooped in to buy them. Jack's heart sank as he realized the truth. The HOA wasn't just a group of overzealous neighbors trying to enforce a few rules. It was a corrupt system designed to force homeowners out so that they could turn the neighborhood into a profit-making venture. The more Jack uncovered, the more disgusted he became. He'd been living in this neighborhood for years, but now he felt like a pawn in a game that was much bigger than he ever could have imagined. He had to do something about it. But what could one man do against such a powerful network of corruption? The realization hit Jack hard. He had worked so long and so hard for this. His dream home, his sanctuary. The thought of losing it, of losing everything he had worked for, was unbearable. And yet, the threat was real. The fines were mounting. The HOA was relentless, and Jack could feel the walls closing in on him. His health had already been declining, and the stress of the ongoing conflict was taking a toll on his body. He felt powerless, unable to fight back against the forces that seemed so much stronger than he was. But it wasn't just his home that was at risk. It was his dignity, his sense of safety, and his future. Jack was terrified of what would happen if he gave up. What would happen if he just allowed this corrupt system to win? Would he lose everything he had worked for, just like the other homeowners? But something inside him refused to let that happen. Jack wasn't a man who gave up easily. If he was going to go down, he was going to go down fighting. He just needed to figure out how. And that's when he had a breakthrough. He realized that he didn't have to do this alone. If he could gather the evidence, expose the corruption, and rally his neighbors, maybe, just maybe, he could take down this corrupt HOA and get his life back. But it wouldn't be easy. There were dark forces at work here, and Jack was up against a system that had already ruined the lives of so many. He had to be smart. He had to be patient. And most of all, he had to be brave. Because the fight ahead wasn't just about saving his home. It was about standing up for what was right and showing the world that even in the face of adversity, one person could make a difference. As Jack sat alone in his quiet home, staring at yet another fine, he felt a sense of growing despair. He had tried everything he could to reason with the HOA, but the more he did, the more he realized that these people weren't interested in fairness. They didn't care about the condition of his garden or whether his mailbox was the right shade of blue. No, this was personal. Karen Thompson wasn't just enforcing rules. She was targeting him. But why? What did he do to deserve this relentless attack? The pressure of the fines was building, and with each passing day, Jack felt like his dream home was slipping further and further out of his grasp. In a final attempt to get some answers, Jack decided to reach out for legal help. He made an appointment with a lawyer, hoping that they could offer some insight into his options. But when the lawyer heard his story, there was no sympathy, just a grim look. "Jack, I'm sorry," the lawyer said, shaking his head. "The HOA has an iron grip on this neighborhood. Fighting them could take years. And in the meantime, those fines will keep piling up." Jack felt his stomach sink. Was there no hope? Was his life's work about to be destroyed by a bunch of petty bureaucrats? His sense of justice, however, wouldn't allow him to just give up. He knew he couldn't let this happen. His home, the home where he had poured so much of his heart and soul, was being threatened by people who cared more about power than right or wrong. Jack wasn't going to stand by and let this happen without a fight. He couldn't. His health was already starting to deteriorate from the stress, but his spirit wasn't broken yet. He still had one card left to play: knowledge. Jack knew he had to uncover the truth, no matter how hard it might be. And in the process, he'd learned the most valuable lesson of all, that sometimes justice is something you have to fight for yourself. As the days passed, Jack grew more and more suspicious. His once quiet neighborhood had become a battleground, with tension in the air. He began noticing odd patterns in the properties that had been targeted by the HOA. More and more homes were being sold under market value, and the buyers always seemed to be connected to Karen Thompson's brother's development company. He could no longer ignore the truth that had been staring him in the face for months. The HOA wasn't just a group of rule enforcers, it was a scheme. A well-organized scheme to push homeowners out of their homes so that Karen's brother could buy their properties at a fraction of their worth and build lucrative developments in their place. Jack's suspicion grew into certainty. The very organization that was supposed to protect the community was, in fact, destroying it. And what made it even worse was that the other homeowners didn't seem to understand what was happening. They were scared, isolated, and most of them had already given up the fight. They had no idea that the HOA wasn't working for them. It was working against them. Jack couldn't sit idly by anymore. He knew something had to be done to expose the corruption at the heart of the HOA. But the more he dug, the more he realized that the problem was bigger than he thought. Jack had always trusted the HOA to maintain peace in the neighborhood, but now he knew it had been working in secret for years to line the pockets of a few wealthy individuals. The neighborhood he had called home was nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game. Jack's frustration grew, but so did his resolve. He knew that if he didn't act now, the same thing that had happened to others would eventually happen to him. He was fighting not just for his home, but for the community he had been a part of for so long. Jack's resolve hardened as he made the decision to fight back. It wasn't enough to just resist the fines anymore. He had to understand exactly what was going on behind the scenes. So he began his investigation, staying up late at night, scouring the HOA's documents and newsletters, trying to find anything that would link Karen Thompson to the shady deals he had begun to suspect. He pored over property records, and with each passing day, the picture became clearer. 7 families had sold their homes in the past 5 years, all due to mounting fines and threats from the HOA. What was most disturbing was that all these homes had been bought by Thompson Development Group. The pieces were finally fitting together. Karen's brother was systematically purchasing these homes at below market value, and the HOA was facilitating this by driving the property values down. Jack's hands trembled as he put all the pieces together. This wasn't just about a few petty fines or a vendetta against him. It was a criminal conspiracy designed to steal people's homes. And the worst part was that no one seemed to be doing anything about it. Jack realized that he was in the fight of his life. It wasn't just about standing up to Karen. It was about taking down the entire corrupt system that was ruining people's lives. But Jack was no longer alone in this fight. He had gathered the evidence, and he was determined to take it public. His plan was risky, and the road ahead would be treacherous. But Jack wasn't about to back down. He had already lost too much, and now he was going to make sure the truth came out. The situation with the HOA escalated faster than Jack could have ever imagined. Just when he thought he had gained some ground, something devastating happened. It started with a phone call. His house had been scheduled for an emergency inspection. Something he found out later was a ruse. The HOA claimed it was for fire hazards, but Jack knew better. They had been planning this for weeks. The inspection was a cover for something far worse. That afternoon, 3 men from the HOA arrived at his house, all wearing official-looking shirts, but something about them fell off. They insisted on inspecting every part of his property, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were doing more than just checking for safety violations. They were there for another reason. When they left, everything seemed normal, except Jack's security system had been tampered with. He tried to stay calm, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. It wasn't until the next morning that his fears were realized. Jack awoke to the sound of sirens. His home, his dream home, was on fire. The flames were already consuming everything, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His heart sank as he watched the fire truck struggle to contain the blaze. As he stood helplessly on the street, watching his entire life's work burn to the ground, he saw Karen across the street. She wasn't offering help. She wasn't calling for backup. No, she was standing there, arms crossed, with a slight smile playing on her lips. It was a smile Jack would never forget. The fire was no accident. Jack knew that now. Someone had deliberately overloaded his electrical system, and he was certain that the HOA had orchestrated this. But why? Why destroy his home, his life, and everything he had worked for? It wasn't just about driving him out anymore. It was about making sure he had nothing left to fight with. As Jack stood on the street, watching the flames destroy his home, he felt his heart shatter. Years of hard work, sacrifice, and memories were disappearing in front of his eyes. He had already lost so much, his health, his peace of mind, and now his home was gone, too. It was as though his entire life had been swept away in a matter of hours. But even in the face of overwhelming heartbreak, Jack refused to give up. The pain of losing his home was deep, but it wasn't the end of his story. For the first time in weeks, Jack realized that he still had something left. His fight. His home was gone, but his spirit wasn't. And that was something that couldn't be taken away. He would rebuild, not just his house, but his life, and the lives of the people who had suffered at the hands of Karen and the HOA. Jack's desperation to find justice had reached its peak. He knew the road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but he was no longer afraid of the fight. What had been taken from him could never be replaced, but what he could do now was expose the truth. And in the process, he would teach a powerful lesson. Sometimes, it's the things you lose that give you the strength to take down the people who think they can break you. Jack had lost everything, but he was about to show the world that he had the power to rebuild it all. After the fire consumed Jack's home, his world felt shattered. The heartbreak was beyond measure. His life's work, everything he had built, was gone in an instant. But the worst part was the realization that it hadn't been a random fire. No, this was deliberate. This was arson. The fire investigators confirmed it. Jack's worst fears had come true. His home wasn't just a casualty of an accident. It had been a targeted attack, designed to destroy him and break his spirit. Jack, sitting in the ashes of what used to be his sanctuary, felt a wave of grief. It was as though his entire life had crumbled in a single horrific moment. But as the initial shock began to wear off, a new feeling took its place. Anger. Raw, unrelenting anger. Whoever was responsible for this fire had underestimated Jack. They thought they could take everything from him and leave him powerless. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Jack's resolve grew stronger with every passing day. He wasn't going to let Karen and her corrupt cronies get away with this. Not only had they destroyed his home, but they had crossed a line. Now it was personal. Now he was going to make them pay. Just when Jack thought the worst was behind him, he received another crushing blow. He contacted his insurance company, fully expecting them to help him rebuild. After all, he had paid his premiums on time, and his policy clearly included fire damage. But the response he received was not what he expected. The agent on the other end of the line was polite but cold. "Mr. Winters, we have a problem," the agent said, almost apologetically. "Your policy was changed 3 weeks ago, and the new terms specifically exclude coverage for fire damage." Jack's heart dropped into his stomach. How could this be? He had never authorized any change to his policy. Furious, he demanded to see the paperwork. When the agent sent it over, Jack couldn't believe his eyes. The signature on the document wasn't his. It was a forgery, and not even a good one. The insurance company had been complicit in the scheme, and Jack realized that someone had been working behind the scenes to make sure he couldn't rebuild. His dreams were slipping further out of his reach, and the weight of it all threatened to crush him. But Jack wasn't one to back down in the face of adversity. This new betrayal fueled his determination even more. If Karen and her network thought they could destroy him, they were sorely mistaken. They had just lit a fire within him that would not be extinguished. It was time to take action. Determined to uncover the truth, Jack took matters into his own hands. He hired a private investigator to dig deeper into the circumstances surrounding the fire. It didn't take long for the investigator to uncover disturbing evidence. Someone had tampered with his electrical system before the fire. This wasn't just a random accident. It was a deliberate act of sabotage. Jack's blood ran cold when he learned the truth. The very people he had trusted, the people who were supposed to be working for the well-being of the neighborhood, had conspired against him. The tampering was no accident. It was a calculated move to destroy his home and drive him out. But who could have done this? The investigators soon discovered that Karen Thompson had been involved. She had orchestrated the whole thing, using her influence to access Jack's property under the guise of an inspection. It was a moment of clarity for Jack. Everything he had suspected was now confirmed. Karen wasn't just a petty HOA president. She was a criminal, willing to go to any lengths to destroy people's lives for personal gain. But Jack had the evidence now. He wasn't going to let this slide. Karen had made a grave mistake, and Jack was going to make sure she paid for it. Jack's life had been shattered, but in the wreckage, something had changed. He wasn't the same person he had been before the fire. The man who had once been content to live a quiet life in his dream home was now a force to be reckoned with. His pain had turned into purpose, and he was determined to expose the corruption that had ruined his life and the lives of so many others. With the help of his lawyer and the private investigator, Jack compiled all the evidence he had gathered. The forged insurance documents, the tampered electrical system, and the connections between Karen Thompson and her brother's development company. Jack knew he couldn't just sit back and let this slide. He needed to go public. He needed to make sure that everyone in the neighborhood knew the truth about what was really happening. He attended a city council meeting, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment where he would make sure that Karen and her corrupt network would be exposed for all to see. He presented his evidence to the council, and the room went silent. There was no denying it now. Karen had been targeting homeowners, pushing them to sell their properties at a loss, so that her brother could buy them for cheap and develop the land into something far more lucrative. The response was immediate. A city inspector promised to investigate the HOA's practices. The winds of change were beginning to blow, and Jack could feel it. He wasn't just fighting for his own home anymore. He was fighting for the future of his entire neighborhood, and he was about to turn the tables on Karen Thompson in a way she never saw coming. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in months, Jack felt a glimmer of hope. The city council had agreed to investigate the HOA's practices, and for the first time, he felt like the tide was turning. But Jack knew that this was just the beginning. He had exposed the corruption, but the real battle was still ahead. With the investigation underway, Jack realized that he had a rare opportunity to take control of the situation. The HOA, which had been working against him, was about to find itself under a much bigger microscope. And Jack wasn't going to stop there. He had a new plan, one that would hit Karen and her associates where it hurt the most, their power. Jack decided to take a bold step. He began the process of purchasing a stake in Evergreen Community Management, the company that ran the HOA. He knew that by gaining control, he could dismantle the corrupt system from the inside. The HOA had taken everything from him, but now Jack was going to take everything from them. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about making sure that no one else would have to go through the same suffering that he had endured. Jack wasn't just going to sit back and let this happen to other people. He was going to be the one to bring justice, to rebuild the neighborhood, and to make sure the corrupt system was finally torn down. It was going to take time, effort, and a great deal of courage, but Jack was ready. He had nothing left to lose, and everything to gain. After Jack's confrontation with the city council, he felt a surge of power. He had uncovered the truth, and now it was time to confront Karen Thompson head-on. Jack knew that Karen wasn't going to give up easily. She had the entire HOA behind her, and the influence of her development company was vast. But the more Jack learned, the more he understood that this wasn't just about righting a wrong. It was about taking down an empire of corruption built on greed and manipulation. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and Jack walked into the community center with a calm determination. As the board members chatted, Karen stood at the podium, acting as if she had the situation under control. The air was thick with tension. Jack had already gathered all his evidence: the forged documents, the tampered electrical system, the selective enforcement of fines, and the connections between the HOA and Thompson Development Group. He had all the ammunition he needed, and now he was going to fire it all at once. As the meeting progressed, Karen continued to belittle the neighbors and push her agenda, showing slides of Jack's burned-down home and making him the scapegoat for all the neighborhood's problems. But Jack was prepared. He stood up, walking toward the front of the room. The murmurs died down as he calmly opened a folder containing all his documents and evidence. He didn't shout, didn't lose his cool. He simply stated the facts. This HOA has been targeting homeowners for years, and I can prove it. The room fell silent. The tension was palpable. Jack knew the fight wasn't over, but as he spoke, he saw the flicker of doubt in the eyes of some of the board members. For the first time, Karen wasn't the one in control, and that feeling of power, of reclaiming what had been stolen from him, was intoxicating. The moment Jack exposed the truth at the meeting was a turning point. The board members were rattled. They were no longer able to dismiss his claims as a personal vendetta. Jack had laid bare the conspiracy, and now Karen Thompson's iron grip on the neighborhood was starting to slip. The other homeowners, some of whom had been silently suffering for years, began to speak up. One by one, they shared their own stories of harassment, of being forced to sell their homes for pennies on the dollar. Their voices joined Jack's in calling for change. But Karen wasn't about to let go of her power so easily. As the meeting ended, she tried to rally the board to vote against any further investigation. Her usual calm composure was beginning to crack. Jack could see the fear in her eyes as the whispers spread through the room. This wasn't the same HOA that had terrorized him for months. This was a wounded animal, backed into a corner. The next day, Jack received an email from his lawyer. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The city had agreed to audit the HOA's finances, and that audit was going to dig deeper than Karen ever imagined. Jack had learned that no matter how powerful someone might seem, when the truth comes out, they will crumble. Despite his success in exposing the HOA's illegal activities, Jack knew the real fight was just beginning. Karen wasn't going to give up without a battle. In the weeks following the city council meeting, Jack received threatening phone calls from Karen's allies, some of whom were also on the board. They tried to intimidate him into backing down, telling him he was fighting a losing battle. But Jack wasn't afraid anymore. They had tried to break him once, but now he was the one with the power. Jack had one final bold move. He decided to take control of the situation once and for all by purchasing a controlling interest in Evergreen Community Management, the private company that ran the HOA. By gaining control of this company, Jack could dismantle the corrupt system from the inside. He wasn't just going to take down Karen. He was going to make sure this kind of abuse never happened again. The transaction was completed quickly, but quietly. Jack didn't want Karen to see him coming. When he was ready, he called for an emergency HOA meeting to announce the new ownership. The moment Jack walked into that room, Karen's face went pale. She knew it was over. "I'm here to tell you," Jack said calmly, "that this HOA is about to undergo a complete overhaul. As of today, I am the majority shareholder of Evergreen Community Management. The corruption ends now." The shock on Karen's face was enough to satisfy Jack's thirst for justice. He wasn't just taking back what was his, he was taking back the entire community. In the days following Jack's takeover of Evergreen Community Management, the neighborhood started to change. The atmosphere that had once been thick with fear and oppression began to shift. For the first time in years, homeowners felt empowered. They realized they didn't have to live in fear of arbitrary fines and rules designed to destroy their lives. They didn't have to sit idly by as the HOA stripped them of their homes and dignity. Jack's first act as the new head of the HOA was to announce a complete audit of the organization's finances. The residents, once too afraid to speak up, began sharing their own stories. Jack knew that exposing Karen's crimes was only the beginning. He wanted to make sure that those who had suffered, like the elderly couple who had been forced to sell their home to Karen's brother, were given back what they had lost. And that's exactly what he did. Over the next few months, Jack worked tirelessly to rebuild the neighborhood, both physically and emotionally. The homes that had been sold under duress were repurchased, and the victims of the HOA's abuse were given compensation. What had once been a place of oppression and fear became a community where neighbors cared for one another, supported each other, and took pride in their shared space. For Jack, it was a victory not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been bullied, threatened, or silenced. He had turned his grief and anger into something positive, a better future for the people he cared about. The lesson was clear. When you stand up for what's right, even the most corrupt systems can be taken down. As the neighborhood slowly healed and the HOA's corrupt practices were exposed, Jack found himself standing in front of his rebuilt home. It wasn't the same as it had been before, but it didn't have to be. This house, this neighborhood, had been transformed. The pain of losing his old home, his sanctuary, would never go away. But what he had gained, what he had fought for, was far more valuable. Jack had learned that revenge wasn't what he truly wanted. Yes, he had wanted justice. Yes, he had wanted to see Karen and her associates pay for what they had done. But what Jack found in the end was that rebuilding the community, restoring dignity, and giving people their lives back was more satisfying than any act of revenge ever could be. He stood in his front yard, watching as his neighbors laughed and talked, enjoying the newfound peace. The neighborhood picnic, which Jack had helped organize, was in full swing. People were smiling, talking, and reconnecting. It was a simple moment, but for Jack, it was everything. The community that had been torn apart by corruption and fear was finally whole again. Jack had lost everything once, but in doing so, he had gained something far more meaningful, the power to rebuild, to heal, and to lead. And that, he knew, was the true victory. In the aftermath of Jack's victory, he stood at a crossroads. He had won. He had exposed the corruption, dismantled the HOA's reign of terror, and regained control over his community. He had fought back with everything he had, and in the end, he had triumphed. But as the weeks passed, Jack began to reflect on the toll the battle had taken on him. Yes, he had avenged the wrongs done to him. And yes, Karen and her allies had faced justice. But was it enough? Jack realized that, while he had sought revenge for the destruction of his home, it had come at a personal cost. His relationships had been strained, his health had deteriorated, and his peace of mind had been shattered. Revenge, as sweet as it had seemed in the moment, had consumed him. He had poured all of his energy into bringing down those who had wronged him. But now, in the quiet aftermath, he began to understand the true price of his actions. The lesson was painful but profound. Vengeance might bring temporary satisfaction, but it can never heal the deeper wounds. The real healing, Jack came to understand, was in rebuilding what was lost, not just physical property, but the emotional connections, the peace, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing you've done the right thing. It was about learning to forgive, even when it felt impossible, and finding peace within yourself. Jack's victory had been hard-won, but the true peace he sought was something only time and reflection could bring. As Jack watched the neighborhood transform before his eyes, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. The homes that had been abandoned, the families who had been displaced, were all starting to return. The community that had once been fractured, fearful, and broken was now thriving again. And it was all because Jack had refused to give up. There had been so many times during the ordeal when Jack had felt like throwing in the towel. The fines, the violations, the pressure from the HOA, and the loss of his home had taken a toll on him. He had been pushed to his limits, both physically and emotionally. But through it all, one thing kept him going: his resilience. Jack had learned that, no matter how dark the road might seem, as long as you keep moving forward, there is always a way to win. The road to justice might be long, and the battles may seem endless, but in the end, those who refuse to give up are the ones who succeed. Jack's journey had shown him that resilience isn't just about holding on. It's about adapting, learning, and growing stronger through adversity. It's about pushing through even when the world feels like it's crumbling around you. The lesson Jack now carried with him was simple but powerful: never give up. Because when you refuse to quit, you find the strength to rebuild, to rise from the ashes, and to transform your life in ways you never thought possible. Throughout the entire process, one thing had been Jack's guiding principle: gather the evidence. At every turn, the HOA had tried to intimidate him, silence him, and make him feel like his case was hopeless. But Jack had learned that the truth is a powerful weapon, especially when it's backed by solid evidence. Every violation notice, every photo, every recorded phone call, and every document Jack had collected over the months became a part of his arsenal. The tampered electrical system, the forged insurance papers, and the shady dealings of the HOA board members. All of it was undeniable. Jack didn't rely on hearsay or assumptions. He made sure that every claim he made was supported by proof. This, Jack realized, was the real lesson. In the face of corruption, in the face of injustice, evidence is everything. When you can prove the truth, it cannot be ignored. It was the evidence that had turned the tide in his favor. Without it, he would have been just another voice shouting into the wind. With it, he had become a force for change, a voice of reason that could not be silenced. The truth, no matter how well hidden, always finds a way to surface. And when it does, it can change the world. Jack's journey was not just one of revenge, but also one of self-discovery. As he gained more power within the HOA, he began to realize something important. Power is a double-edged sword. It's one thing to take control and fight back, but it's another thing entirely to wield that power responsibly. At first, Jack was motivated by the desire for justice. But as he began to dismantle the corrupt system, he started to understand that true leadership wasn't about revenge. It was about doing what was best for the community. Jack had always been a fighter, but he had to learn how to be a leader, too. The power he had acquired came with the responsibility to ensure that it was used for the greater good. The people in his community had suffered long enough under Karen's reign. Jack's goal was no longer to tear everything down, but to build something better. As he worked to restructure the HOA, he had to make tough decisions. Decisions that would affect not just his life, but the lives of everyone in the neighborhood. The temptation for personal gain was always there, but Jack knew that if he truly wanted to make a difference, he had to act with integrity. In the end, Jack learned that power should never be abused, and it should always be used for the benefit of others. The lesson was clear. Leadership isn't about control or domination. It's about serving those who depend on you and using your influence to build, not destroy. As Jack stood in the middle of the now thriving neighborhood, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The battle he had fought wasn't just about rebuilding a home. It was about rebuilding a community, a sense of trust, and a belief that justice could prevail. The streets were filled with families once again, laughing and playing. The community garden, which had once been abandoned and overrun with weeds, was now a place where neighbors gathered to share stories and enjoy each other's company. But the most rewarding part of Jack's journey wasn't the physical rebuilding. It was the emotional and social restoration that had taken place. Jack had learned that true success wasn't measured by how much money you made or how many battles you won. It was measured by the impact you had on the lives of others. The relationships he had formed, the lives he had touched, and the way the neighborhood had come together were the real rewards of his struggle. Jack had gone through the fire, literally and figuratively, and come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more committed to the values that had always guided him. He had lost everything once, but in doing so, he had discovered the true meaning of home. It wasn't just a building or a piece of land. It was the people you share it with, the memories you create together, and the community you build. The fight had been long, but in the end, it had been worth it. Jack had not only rebuilt his home, but he had helped rebuild the spirit of the community. And that, he knew, was the true victory.